Hey, it's Professor Gould, and in this lecture, we're going to start talking about evolution by natural selection, the theory developed by Charles Darwin. So let's start off by explaining what is evolution. Evolution is just a change in allele frequency over time. So if you have 48% of the genes in a gene pool are the dominant H in one generation, and then they're 50% in the next generation, that is a change. That is evolution. That doesn't seem like much. It is a dominant trait becoming more common. And if you give it a lot of time, these very small changes can add up to big changes. Time and change in environment. Okay, but the amount of time we're talking about is really, really hard to imagine. So here's the example that I like to use to understand how much a billion is. We think like million and then billion is next, right? A billion is 1,000 millions. So think of it this way. If you started getting $5,000 every single day from the time Christopher Columbus stumbled onto North America until today, now discount any kind of compound interest. Just every single morning, somebody hands you $5,000 and has been doing that for the 419 years since Columbus stumbled on North America. You would still not have $1 billion. $5,000 a day for 400 years, you would only have about $750 million. So that's $1 billion is so big. It's so big. So when we are talking about evolutionary time, we are talking usually in terms of millions and billions of years. And these are very, very long periods of time. So there's lots of time for small changes to add up to big changes. So that's one really important thing about evolution. Okay. There are a number of evolutionary processes which we will talk about. Natural selection is the most common and the most powerful. And all it means is that individuals with traits that are favorable in a certain environment are able to survive and pass on those traits, and that leads to a change in allele frequency. Excuse me. So individuals who are the best fit to a certain environment are able to survive and pass on those traits, and those traits become more common in subsequent generations. Now, the theory of evolution by natural selection was developed by Charles Darwin. He shares this credit with Alfred Russel Wallace, and I will explain that whole story in a few minutes. Darwin published the first and perhaps most important work, or his most important work on this, on the origin of species, in 1859. Okay, so another important thing to remember is that Darwin was not the first person to think about how life on Earth has changed. So a lot of this that I'm going to explain in the next few slides I got from this book, Darwin's Ghosts by Rebecca Stott, which talks about evolutionary thinkers and people who were thinking about the natural world before Darwin. Now, most of these people Darwin didn't know about. He had not read widely on this subject. So he didn't draw on these thinkers very much. Most of them he didn't know about. Okay, so Aristotle. Aristotle learned a lot by talking to local fishermen about the sea life that they saw, by taking samples from their catches and learning about the life in the sea and then later the life on land. And he determined that there were natural laws that governed the design of animals and that animals were perfectly adapted to their environments. Now, he was wrong about that perfect adaptation. Adaptation is not perfect. It's good enough. And that's what evolution works on. Good enough. Aljahees lived around the middle of the 9th century in what is now Iraq. And he wrote the Book of Living Beings, which said that all of nature is interconnected. And he believed that it was all created by God, and that organisms affected each other, but God was running the show. He had read Aristotle. He had also talked to nomads who traveled, around the Arab Peninsula. He had talked to many travelers who passed through what is now Iraq. And he had traveled on his own, and everywhere he went, he examined the natural world. Next up, we're going to skip a bit because there really wasn't a lot of evolutionary thinking during the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages. Abraham Trembley lived in 1741. He figured out that these marine organisms called polyps, it's a hydra, they're these little microscopic marine organisms, that if you cut off their tentacles, or even part of their body, they can regenerate that. And he got help from his son-in-law and some other friends to figure out that, in fact, there was no other organism or process helping the polyp regenerate, that the polyps were, in fact, regenerating on their own. Humans obviously can't do that. We lose a body part and it's gone. We can't regenerate it. And this led Trembley and others to start thinking about maybe humans were not the most perfect creatures on the planet, which was kind of a wild idea at the time in a primarily Christian world that had grown up believing that God created a perfect world, exactly the way that it is today. Erasmus Darwin. Yes, Darwin. He was Charles's grandfather, and he was a physician and also a natural philosopher, what today we call a scientist. And he was one of the first people to say that life began from a single origin and then changed over time. He thought that organisms improved themselves and got better over time, reaching, the pinnacle, of course, with humans, which are, of course, the most perfect organisms. Anyone who has had problems with their lower back or their feet might question whether humans are, in fact, perfect organisms. But he thought that organisms improved themselves. He did believe that God created all of it. He is more famous for his erotic poetry about plants called The Loves of Plants. And sure, go ahead and go look that up. It's interesting. JeanBaptiste Lamarck is someone that Darwin had read, and he theorized that species change to adapt to their environment primarily through the use and disuse of traits. So the giraffe got a longer neck because it stretched its neck to reach higher branches. Now, apparently he had never talked to a farmer who had bred farm animals because any farmer could have told him that the biggest, strongest bull does not necessarily have the biggest, strongest offspring. The most muscular bull does not have the most muscular offspring. But whatever. It turns out he was wrong, but not as wrong as most people have thought for decades. Turns out that use and disuse does have an effect on gene expression, even across generations. So Lamarck was still not, at heart correct, but he was onto something which we are learning more about now. We'll talk more about that later. In the early 1800s, when Darwin was working, there were a lot of people working on understanding natural laws, understanding the organisms in the world, and trying to understand the rules that governed changes in nature. So three of them, these three men were all working in Paris Georges Cuvier, Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, and the Comte de Buffon. And all of these three were working in Paris, working together, talking with each other, writing together with some other people. All wrote works that were read by Darwin and other thinkers and set the stage for thinking about how species change and what the natural laws are, and the idea that there are natural laws governing the way nature works, which was an unusual idea at the time. Remember, these are all people living in a Christian world where everything depends on God. And so to say that there are natural laws that operate outside of God was a somewhat revolutionary and kind of dangerous idea. So what I want you to know, I do not need you to know all of these names. I know this is a bunch of white guys, except for Aljahees. They're all middle-aged white men in Europe. But what I want you to know is that the idea of evolution, the idea that species change over time, that organisms alive today are different from organisms that existed previously, that idea was not new to Darwin. There were lots of people who had been and were at that time talking about that. The primary mechanism of evolution, natural selection, that was Darwin's groundbreaking idea. And that is the thing for which he rightly deserves a lot of credit. So in the next section, I'm going to talk about who Darwin was, what his background was, and how all of that and his experience led to his development of this theory of evolution by natural selection.